In 1985, David Robie spent 10 weeks on the Greenpeace protest ship, the Rainbow Warrior, as the only New Zealand journalist accompanying the campaigners. His tiny cabin was deep in the hull of the ship, alongside the cabin of photographer Fernando Pereira. Just days after David disembarked, the ship was blown up by French secret agents in Auckland's Waitemata harbour. David's crewmate Fernando lost his life as the ship sank, and the bunk that David had occupied for the last few months at sea was completely destroyed. David's coverage of the ship's adventures, and in particular the voyage to the Marshall Islands, as well as the later sabotage, saw him win the New Zealand Media Peace Prize in 1985. He wrote a book called Eyes of Fire, which documents the Rainbow Warrior story. Now Professor Robie, he lectures at AUT University in the School of Communication Studies, as well as running the Pacific Media Centre. David's connection to the Greenpeace movement and the effect of the French bombings remains as one of the most significant events in his life. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us.
Kia ora, Hayley.
Now, let's go back to July the 10th, 1985. Where and when were you on this evening, and when you heard of the news?
Well, I was at home actually, in bed, in a real bed, in Grey Lynn, a very short distance away from the Marsden Wharf. But I've been on board for more than 10 weeks or so, in the bunks and so on. So it was really great to get back ashore. So we arrived on the 7th in Auckland, and so I went ashore then. So it was all an incredible shock. In fact, I got phoned early in the morning of the bombing, and I went down straight away to the wharf and met crew, and there was a cafe just across the road. There were people gathering there at that time.
And what was going through your head when you first heard of the news?
Oh, I thought sabotage straight away, and particularly there was the two explosions figured to me, but also because I had been a journalist covering Pacific issues all around the region, and I'd been in 1984. I'd been in New Caledonia, and there'd been a massacre in Yangon and the New Caledonia part right towards the end of the year, and then there'd been a assassination of a Kanak independence leader in early 1985, before the Rainbow Warrior bombing. So it was all part of this pattern. There's a deep paranoia. Although I didn't think that the French could be crazy enough to actually sort of have an operation like this in New Zealand against a peaceful ship. But the actual thing of the sabotage, I thought, well, it fits into the general pattern of what was happening in the Pacific at the time. And
so you were covering the flagship the whole way through. How difficult was it for you to cover the stories after the bombing?
Well, it had a big impact on me, just like everybody in the crew, but also had a big impact, I guess, in my actual working as a journalist. I had been an environmental journalist up until that point, and I'd covered independence issues in the region, and so it was very much a specialty for me. But it sort of hardened my resolve, and especially what happened to Fernando as being a photographer on board and that sort of thing, hardened my resolve to continue in this sort of role. But I was arrested later that year in December in New Caledonia on another visit I went over there by French troops, and I was tailed around by secret agents for two weeks. And this actually made a story in the local news magazine in Fiji, and also in the New Zealand Times. It sort of like affected me at other times since then. There was a sort of the wave of paranoia, and I was also perceived, I guess, to be anti-French, which I'm not. I lived in France for a number of years and worked for a French news agency. But because I wrote a lot about the nuclear-free issues and also about the independence struggles, I was seen by, I guess, in a lot of French circles as being anti-French.
When really you were just reporting
really
facts,
I was just doing my job, really doing, but I was committed to telling the stories that weren't being told, particularly about Indigenous struggles in the region.
And so you mentioned Fernando. Were you two very close? How did his death affect you, I guess?
Well, I guess it is, look, for me, it was something of a kindred spirit, because he was a photographer on board, but he was the official Greenpeace photographer. I was just there as a freelancer. And I had to sort of arrange all my sort of outlets for media and things like that. But he was a bit of a, because I was really a journalist, primarily a journalist, although I'd taken photographs over many years. And because he was a professional photographer, I found him very much a sort of a mentor and very much a supporter in, basically covering the region.
And on the evening of the bombing, was there any chance that you could have been on board?
Oh yeah. I mean, like, because I'd been there the evening before, and there'd been a celebration, but I wasn't actually going to be on board for the birthday for Steve Sawyer, who was the campaign director at the time. But I had been trying to sort of arrange, after we'd arrived in New Zealand, I'd been trying to arrange for my young sons, Lucien, who was born in France actually, and he was 9 at the time, and the younger son, Simeon, 5. And I'd been trying to sort of arrange that they could actually come on board as a bit of a scout group, and I was arranging with the Cubs, the younger branch of Scouts, and I was trying to arrange it through the Cub Master at the time, but it never actually sort of worked out. So it was, probably fortuitous, although I wouldn't have been there that late anyway.
Yeah. And so after the bombing, was there a time where you did go back to see the ship and try to recollect anything, or just to take it all in, what had really happened to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the shock went on for a long time, and I guess it was still a shock when I had the opportunity to go over on the Devonport Naval Base. I think it was a media opportunity that we actually had to go in and take some photographs and so on. But one of the things that really stands out for me, well, I mean, because that's when I got to actually see what it was like in the cabin that I'd been staying in, and there was a stairway between the Fernando's cabin and my cabin down below, but the thing that sort of stood out for me was that because I took everything off when we arrived in Auckland, but there was something I forgot. And it was my passport, which was still sitting in the bridge. I travel. Well, I'm sort of a bi-passport holder, but I'm a Kiwi. But of course, I had a British passport, at the time, and this actually sank with the Rainbow Warrior, and it was recovered later with other things that are on board, and it was actually sort of treated. And so that's the only thing that I have as a physical souvenir from the Rainbow Warrior.
That's incredible. And when you were covering this whole disaster, how do you think the general public of New Zealand were reacting to the issue?
Well, first, I mean, just as we were shocked, the entire country was shocked. I mean, at first, the disbelief, because a lot of rumours and a lot of speculation and all sorts of reports came out at one stage. I remember a lot of misleading, and I think there's a lot of misinformation, because that's how intelligence services operate all the time. They feed misinformation into media and so on, and it clouds the issues. And so the rumours and stories about mercenaries in New Caledonia that were responsible, and all these nonsensical stories, and so distracted away from the fact that the French government and the official DGSC were responsible for this. But as a nation, this was a coming of age for us. I mean, I think we lost our innocence then, and the idea that a friendly nation could commit an act of state terrorism against us, a small nation in the southern hemisphere, and against a peaceful ship, and for people who are simply trying to make a better world and trying to make a better environment and so on. So that shock, I think, was shared by everybody in the country for a long time. And there's a lot of hostility towards France, which receded over years, but at that time it was absolutely terrible. And I was chatting to my son, who's now a doctor in Australia, Lucien, just a few nights ago, and he was saying, because he didn't remember a great deal because he was just 9 at the time, but he was telling me that he was very conscious that because he was born in France and he had a French name, Lucien, that he sort of needed to keep that a bit quiet, because it's sort of so even as a young person like that, sort of the repercussions were pretty profound.
Do you think that because of this whole event happening, that Greenpeace then was actually brought to the forefront more in New Zealand, that people were supporting it more than they had before?
Oh, absolutely, because I remember I had to make a critical decision about going on the Rainbow Warrior. I was freelance at the time, it's very hard to make a living, and to actually go for 10 weeks on a voyage like this. And Elaine Shaw was then the coordinator of Greenpeace in Auckland, and then at that stage they just had a little office in Nagle House in the middle of Auckland. And she persuaded me to go because she felt it was really important to have a journalist from this part of the world to report on what was happening. You know, but it's totally counterproductive from France's point of view, because here they're thinking, oh, they can just bomb a ship, and with a callous disregard for life. It's probably a miracle that more people didn't actually die that night. But anyway, in fact, it actually sort of fueled support in New Zealand, but globally, but particularly in New Zealand. I think there was a wave of sympathy and support for Greenpeace and for what it stood for, what it was trying to do in terms of issues in the region.
So you would believe that Rainbow Warrior's experiences and voyages really achieved what Greenpeace was always setting out to achieve? Oh,
absolutely. And of course there was the fleet still went on tomorrow afterwards and so on. And the issues went on until 1996, when France finally stopped nuclear testing. So ultimately there was the success, but the struggle's not over yet, because there's all the people of Rongelap and also the people who've been affected by radiation in Polynesia. The serious issues about the illnesses. There's been battles for compensation, for full inquiries. There've been some sort of mealy inquiries that have happened, but nothing really critical that's really important. So that struggle continues on. I guess one of the things that really stands out for me too is that I was writing recently for another book they had published last year, and I had a lot of the photographs that were taken at the time of the Rongelap voyage and after the bombing that were put on an exhibition in New Zealand, and some of these images that were as they came forward, and I've been working about how climate change is affecting globally, particularly throughout the Pacific. And the people of Taku Atoll it's this Polynesian atoll, but in Papua New Guinea, which is primarily Melanesian, and the people had to give up their home and dismantle all and they had to make this decision, because essentially climate change was affecting their whole livelihood, and so many of the people, they were divided between the older people and younger people, and older people wanted to stay, younger people went on to Bougainville. But the scenes, and we're going to see that sort of thing more and more, because I think climate change and climate change refugees and nuclear refugees, there's a connection there, and it's going to be a major problem for our globe.
So 30 years on, and this whole story has really affected your life and career. What remains your most memorable moment of being on board the Rainbow Warrior?
Oh, well, I think the whole experience of moving an entire community and a village. I mean, and within days, because we arrived there, the village was still basically there, and within days everything was taken down and put onto the Rainbow Warrior and the voyages that went to Majato. I remember sort of feeling. People were quite stoic about it, particularly older people. But in the process of taking photographs and talking to people and so on, it's just staggering that a whole community, and in the Pacific, land is everything. Land is culture. Land is ancestry, what we live for, and so on. And so to make that decision to go from Rongelap to Majato was just such a emotional and emotional for the people, but also emotional for us to take it. And when the bombing happened, I'd planned to write a book, and I tried to be faithful to that because the book was about the people of Rongelap itself, and I tried to be faithful to that, what had happened to them, because I think in New Zealand we focused quite naturally, I suppose, on the bombing, and the people's plight and their story was sort of lost in the process.
Just as important. Well, thank you so much for joining us, David. It's been brilliant hearing all your stories, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Cool. I think we have to keep